warm welcome to this evening's presentation on modern slavery. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Chris Buckwell. I'm a Deputy Chairman of our organisation. I'm joined by Peter Friedman, who is one of our distinguished Vice Chairmen, and Peter will conduct the question and answer session. We're very grateful to Alessandro for organising this evening's very interesting presentation. We have some guests attending in addition to members, and of course everyone is equally welcome. The formal introduction of Kevin Hyland, our speaker this evening, is to be undertaken by Cecilia Taylor-Kamara, and she is present with us. So Cecilia, I'll hand over to you now very kindly to introduce Kevin. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Chris. I am Cecilia Taylor-Kamara from the Bishops' Conference of England and Wales. It is my pleasure to introduce Kevin Hyland, OBE. Kevin is a senior advisor to the Santamata Group and of the Council of Europe Expert Group. I am sure that most of you are familiar with the Santamata, but for those who are not, please permit me to give a brief account of the Santamata Group and Kevin's role. The genesis of the Santamata Group was a human trafficking project the Bishops' Conference developed over a few years from 2010 in the lead up to the London 2012 Olympics. From the very start, there was a unique collaboration between law enforcement and the church. It started with a conversation between Kevin Hyland and his local justice and peace group in Ware, Hertfordshire. Kevin shared his work at the Human Exploitation Unit of the Metropolitan Police Services with his fellow parishioners, and they were shocked and anxious that human trafficking was taking place in the UK and in Europe at the level that Kevin described. They asked how they could help, and he encouraged them to share the message within their networks. Kevin approached the Bishops' Conference, and it was agreed that the church would work with Kevin to address the issue. I was assigned to work with Kevin in organizing a seminar for the bishops in 2010, at which seminar the bishops gave us the mandate to raise awareness within the church in England and Wales. Recognizing that there were ethnic chaplains from some of the countries of origin of the victims of trafficking, we invited the chaplains to raise awareness of human trafficking in their respective communities so that they could reach out to their nationals and be informed as well as engaged. It was subsequently recommended that a national seminar be convened to bring frontline officers of Catholic agencies, including women religious. A seminar was organized in London in December 2011. Recommendations from the seminar included raising awareness and providing training on human trafficking. The international character of human trafficking prompted a call for an international conference. The first international conference on human trafficking was held in Rome in May 2014, at which representatives from law enforcement officers from the US, Lithuania, Poland, and Italy attended with their corresponding bishops. The conference recommended a follow-on international conference, which conference was held in April 2012. This was the conference at which the Holy Father launched the Santamata Group. The Pope affirmed that the twin strategies of pursuing and prosecuting criminals behind trafficking, as well as providing support for the victims, can and must go together. This is a model that has been continued up to this day, a unique relationship between the church and law enforcement working together with civil society to combat trafficking. Police chiefs at that event signed a declaration. It was a commitment they made that they would continue to work together. At that meeting, Mrs. Theresa May, then Home Secretary, also made a commitment that the UK government will put in place legislation. That legislation became the Modern Slavery Act 2015. The act has now become a blueprint, which some of the other countries, particularly in the Commonwealth, are replicating. Post the SMG conference and following 30-year policing, including leading London's human trafficking unit, In 2014, Kevin Hyland, OBE, was appointed as the UK's first independent anti-slavery commissioner, serving with distinction until 2018. He was the author of the Sustainable Development Goal 8.7 and led efforts for its inclusion for the eradication of human trafficking within the UN 15-year global goals. These efforts were personally supported by Pope Francis. In 2018, Kevin was elected as Ireland's Council of Europe representative to the Independent Group of Experts for Trafficking. He was instrumental in the establishment and remains chief advisor to the Santamata Group, a high-level partnership between law enforcement agencies, faith groups, and civil society, which Pope Francis launched at the Vatican in 2014. Kevin Hyland also leads several international anti-trafficking projects, chairing the Responsible Recruitment Group of the Institute of Human Rights and Businesses and the Island of Ireland Human Trafficking Project, and provides strategic leadership to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe in producing global victim support guidance. He is the recipient of numerous awards, including for bravery and investigating serious organized crime at the UN level, for his work in human rights and equality. In 2018, he was the co-recipient of the Holy See UN Path to Peace Award. And in 2015, he was appointed OBE in the Queen's New Year's honors. Ladies and gentlemen, I proudly present a colleague, a very influential member of the Santamata Group, our speaker for tonight, Kevin Hyland, OBE.
Good evening, and thank you very much for that introduction, Cecilia. It's great to have you with us tonight, and thank you very much, and I'm honoured to be invited to speak to such a good group, an influential group. But it always brings shame on us that we are meeting to talk about an issue of human trafficking. And the fact that this is in existence today as a crime across the world is something that should bring shame on us, because until we realize what this crime is, then we can't really respond to it. And I think that when we look at the characteristics of this crime and we start to think about the numbers of people involved, it's 40 million lives around the world who are affected today in this crime. During the time of Wilberforce and others who led in the fight against slavery of the transatlantic times, it's estimated there were about 15 million who were suffering and exploited. But of course, at the moment, as we've heard many times, children are exploited at an incredible rate, currently at 151 million around the world. Cecilia mentioned where this road started with the Santamata Group, and it was in Ware in Hertfordshire, which has some notoriety in the fight against slavery and human trafficking, because there is a monument to Thomas Clarkson, who on his way back from Cambridge University, having received an award for his writings in Latin on the slave trade of the transatlantic days, he thought, and he then took an oath to himself, that he would work with Parliament and others, including William Wilberforce, to make sure that this crime was exposed and eradicated. So Ware has been a significant place in which this crime has had an ending, but we're a long way from ending it yet. But if we look what is available to us both nationally and internationally to fight this crime in the terms of legislation, and there are many pieces of legislation from the UN with the Palermo Protocol, from the Council of Europe with a binding treaty or a binding protocol, which the UK is a full signatory to and has done much to influence. There is also supply chain legislation within the UK Act, which I will speak about. But there are also other, like the G20, like the human rights of the child, and like the OSCE guidance. But all this has to translate into something that works on the ground. And all of this was put together in the UK in the form of the Modern Slavery Act. And this act was brought in record time under the leadership of Theresa May. And what she did was she brought together both sides of the aisles and made sure that both houses were involved in a debate and a discussion to come up with legislation chaired at the time by Frank Field MP, now obviously Lord Field. And they came up with legislation, which to this day, I would say is groundbreaking. There are many who are now saying it has areas where it could improve, but that's the case with all legislation. But unfortunately, I don't think we're using what we have properly. The legislation under the Modern Slavery Act gives a crime of life imprisonment. So that dictates that this is serious crime, amongst the most serious crime. It has risk and prevention orders available to law enforcement and the National Crime Agency and immigration agencies, so that you can take action before a crime is committed, or if somebody arrives in the UK who has got previous convictions for trafficking, you can take action against them. It has reparation, so that victims can be given awards from confiscation assets at a very early stage. And it creates a lifestyle offence, so you can take money from the last 6 years of a convicted trafficker. It has a statutory defence for the victims. So if they commit a crime whilst in the control of the trafficker, they have a defence. An independent commissioner, which I held the role of, and supply chain transparency, which was one of the instigators to creating more legislation around the world. But let's see, what did this legislation start to do? Well, the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association took up this as a priority and worked with Commonwealth countries across the world. And we then saw Australia. And I went to Australia and worked with them extensively. And since they've introduced their legislation, where their transparency in supply chain is probably more effective than that in the UK, which you would expect. In the UK, companies trading over 36 million have to do a statement to explain what they're doing to eradicate or fight human trafficking or modern slavery in their supply chain. But that statement can be they're doing nothing or they're doing very little. And very often it's been a tick box exercise. Australia mandated that the government had to do transparency in supply chain statements as well, which has now been adopted by the UK government as a voluntary act. But this was important because we need to make sure that taxpayers' money isn't inadvertently or unwittingly ending up in the hands of traffickers in supply chains around the world. But this legislation, it influenced Australia, it influenced Canada, Bangladesh, Malta, Nigeria, the UN Security Council, India, Kenya, Uganda, all countries that started to look at new legislation and more. And then, of course, we looked at this about the risk it's creating as this attracts 150 billion US dollars a year to the criminals who are exploiting in all forms of trafficking, whether that's sexual exploitation, maybe in East London with gangs who are bringing in women and girls to be trafficked for use in illicit sex markets, or whether it's big international companies who have many employees perhaps in supply chains in Southeast Asia or elsewhere in the world. Those are the targets that we need to be focusing on. And whilst it is a smuggling charge, we need to look at things where the magnet to the UK, because of issues like nail bars, car washes, can end in many people taking dangerous routes to the UK, and as we've seen, potentially lose their lives. But there have been some letdowns with the Act, more about implementation than the Act itself. One important factor of the human trafficking response is to that of victims. And in the Council of Europe Convention, that is one factor. And the UK was very quick some years ago in implementing what's called a national referral mechanism, creating an independent place for victims to be referred to and to be supported. But unfortunately, over the last 2 years, the number of victims being positively identified has reduced. There was 10,600 referred into the system in 2019, but as this purple chart shows, only 780 were given status. And the backlog is now so long that there is more waiting than entering the system. So it can take, on average, 452 days for a decision to be made. So you imagine if you were the victim of a crime that held life imprisonment, an armed robbery, an aggravated burglary, a serious assault, and it took the authorities 452 days on average to decide whether you were a victim or not. That is simply not sustainable and not acceptable. And I know there is a lot of effort and a lot of work going into changing that, but it is one of the biggest problems, because then victims lose confidence, the police are not mounting very many prosecutions, and the outputs and the outcomes are far below where they should be. For an example, with the number of victims who entered the system, or potential victims, at 10,600, and research that was accepted widely across the UK that the number of victims in the UK is probably greater or in the region of 100,000, there were only 42 convictions for human trafficking in 2019, fewer than what there were in 2014. And these risk orders that are so useful, if I was still in police, I would have really enjoyed using those. They were only used on 30 occasions in 2019 across the whole of the UK. With 43 police forces in England and Wales alone, that means that pro rata, it's not even one per police force. So these are the situations and issues that really need to be closely scrutinised. And it's not always about resources. It's not always about the technical issues of victims not wanting to give evidence. It's sometimes about policy, approach, and priority. But it's not just the UK that has a problem. It's internationally. There is an issue. In 2019, 118,900 victims were recovered. There were 9,500 convictions across the world. There were 11,841 prosecutions mounted. But in those brackets on the convictions side there, 498 convictions in the whole world for forced labor. So this number of convictions doesn't even amount to 0.02 of the estimated offending. So 99.98% of the time, you get away with it. And less than 0.5% of victims get identified. And if you think 42, maybe more convictions or associated convictions in the UK against 100,000 victims, these figures run true here as well. So really, it runs at the moment that only 1 in every 2,150 victims in the world see their perpetrator convicted. So where do we see this crime? Well, we see it here in the UK in car washes. We see it in garment manufacturing in central England, but we also see it in the agricultural sector, and we see it in cocoa production, or in mica, or in other precious metals that are recovered around the world. And it will be investors, perhaps in the UK, in the US, in Australia, across the world, who are funding very large projects for finding these products. But also it's connected to other crime that is funded. If you think Vietnamese alone, over the period of the last, say, 10 years, there has been 4,500 who have entered into the national referral mechanism. They estimate that it's cost them between 10 and 30,000 pounds each in order to make that journey, paying criminals. They may be smuggled, but at some point their position changes and it may change back. But that is earning anywhere between 45 million and 135 million to the criminals. And then when they arrive in the UK, they are making more monies for the criminals through these cannabis farms or through nail bars or other activities. And that is just one element of criminality and one section of society, Vietnamese. If we then start to look at others, Nigerians who end up in the UK, Eastern Europeans, those who come from the Middle East, we start to see how much danger this creates for individuals, how much threat it provides to our security, but very often our responses aren't commensurate to the risk it presents. I'm all for climate change. I'm all for supporting and eradicating, and the UK is doing an incredible job leading the conference next year in Scotland, and he's taking real leadership. But what we need to remember is there's a great demand on cobalt because we want more batteries for our cars. We're using laptops like we never had done before, and mobile phones. Well, there's a great demand for children to go down the mines in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So we need to think about how we join these things up, which is what the Sustainable Development Goals was around, what the UN guiding principles is around. How do we join up the dots so that one good act doesn't result in another bad act? And if you estimate that the International Labour Organizations say that 22,000 children every year die in abusive labour practices, and we don't know how many thousand adults die like that, and this generates enormous income for criminal activities, we need to give this more priority. We need to make this understood for what it is, a serious crime that is destroying and sometimes taking lives. But there is also other ways that this ends up in supply chains. For example, when I spoke at the International Council of Nursing Conference last year in Singapore, many people, British nurses and nurses from across Europe, representing 20 million nurses, they were shocked that gloves that were being bought into the NHS and other healthcare work providers around the world had come from forced labor in Malaysia. But then the Spice Girls, when they did their comeback, didn't realize that the shirts that they were wearing, selling them for charity, had been made at the hands of forced labor. So we need to understand and join the dots and call these issues to account, but we need more than just campaigns. We need solid activity. And when I was a police officer, we were looking at some of the sexual exploitation in London, with gangs earning £20,000 a day in very high-end apartments, sometimes in Chelsea or Kensington. But one of my greatest assets in fighting that group was a group of religious sisters. And as police, when we raid premises or we're doing operational, we're very driven. We want to get things done quickly. But having these women working with us, and they could take the victims to the care that they had presented, was really something that changed the way my teams viewed this, but also the way that my teams operated. This was groundbreaking. And when I was in the Vatican and Pope Francis, to be able to talk about this in real terms and to give an account of a raid on a Saturday morning at 5 a.m. where we did our role, we went in and we found these women there who wanted to bite and spit at police officers, one in particular, who went back with these women and a trained police woman. We found out then that she'd been raped several times in the hours before, and she was 15. Without that process and that collaboration, we would never have properly identified that victim and, importantly, arrested and prosecuted the perpetrators. An important part that came out of the Santamata Group, which Cecilia so eloquently explained, was the fact that I was able to try to get a sustainable development goal into the UN Sustainable Development Goals in 2015. It was May or June, and it was no SDG. And I approached many, including the Home Secretary, who said it's probably too late to do something now because the drafting has closed. But I got their blessing. So on a Saturday morning, I went and asked the Pope if this was possible, and he made it happen, bringing together the United Kingdom and Argentina. That was the crucial move, something which countries who hadn't really got on well in the past, for reasons we'd all know, collaborated to convince the other 191 UN member states to agree to this Sustainable Development Goal. And SDG 8.7 was born, and it passed when the Pope launched the SDGs at the UN in September of 2015. But what did that do? What did that allow? Well, it allowed budgets, for example, budgets, for example, ODA budgets from around the world, for example, the Security Council, where I presented, the General Assembly, the G20, all of these international bodies and the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association were now given an international target driven by the multilateral community that they could all play a role in. And that has been crucial in raising this agenda and something that was very much down to the leadership of many, not least Theresa May, not least the Pope, not least the Argentinian ambassadors, the British ambassadors around the world, and also organizations like the OSCE, the Council of Europe, and others. So in order to fight this issue, though, we do need more collaboration, but we also need more emphasis on the criminality and what this results in. So we need the justice system, the labour inspectorate like the GLAA, health sector, local authorities, including education, transport, business and trade, and civil society. But this cannot be a fringe exercise. This needs to be integral, just like other things. When we are doing business and trade, like the quality of the goods, we see that the 737 MAX airliner is just been signed off to fly again after 2 years grounded. That was because 300 lives were lost, and right that it was grounded. But that cost Boeing and all the other agencies involved billions. We see that the Volkswagen Golf scandal about emissions, in the US alone, it cost 1.3 billion to Volkswagen Golf in a fine. And we see that British Airways only 3 weeks ago got fined 20 million for having data protection breaches. But when a company has trafficking and exploitation in its supply chain, the company may not face a sanction. They may try to do something afterwards, or they may work positively or produce a better statement, but we need to turn this into something that you avoid. And it's a bit like what Wilberforce did. In his day, slavery was lawful. He had to make it illegal. But then when he made it illegal, yes, it was the deployment of the British Navy and the interception of ships and the fining system that followed. But also, if you look after Wilberforce, in order for Lincoln to make it illegal in the US, he got the support of people in Manchester, where most of the cotton was going to. That then made the difference, so that he was able to stop the funding that was keeping the southern states separate, but also that was keeping the slavery going. So it's so important that we get these as integral parts of what we're doing and realize how serious this is. This isn't about just a sticker and a poster and a campaign. It's about real action embedded into our everyday lives, to the point that we don't even see it, but we don't have to think about it because it's there, just like sending our children to school, just like using the health service, just like driving our cars. The Santamata Group has come from small background in a church hall in Hertfordshire. When I was stood there alongside our Home Secretary and police chiefs and the Pope and Cardinal Vincent, did I think it would come to something that was changing and influencing globally? Did I think that a few years later I would be in Argentina with the police chief, with the Prime Minister, with ministers, and they would then respond with changing legislation, that we would be in Nigeria, that we would be in Myanmar, that we would be in Thailand, Australia, influencing change? I didn't. But what it did show me is that with the right drive, the right compassion, and the clarity, people will come with you. And the Pope's leadership has been crucial in that. I hope this slide works. The technology is not letting it work properly, but these are the countries where Santamata has had some footprint, different in different countries, but it is operating all around the world with the network of the church, but also people who are not Christians, not Catholic, but people of goodwill. And one project I know of that I'm personally involved in India, which is about educating girls. The funding for that, which is the project is run by religious sisters of the Catholic Church, is funded by Muslims. And I've seen girls go in there who have had nothing. And we're having girls who are coming out the other end, and their ambition is to be doctors and airline pilots. That's the reality of what we can achieve if we do it right. I have met some really awful situations. One of the worst must be a young girl I met in southern Italy on the island of Lampedusa. She had come from Eritrea because if she stayed there, she was going to be conscripted into the army and would have 10 years of being exploited, raped daily, beaten. Her parents just couldn't face that. And so they paid for her to be smuggled. What a shocking decision to have to make. And people might label them, say, what sort of parents are they? But they either had to see their daughter abused or take a choice that they would put her to safety of Europe. She traveled up. She was accompanied until she got to Libya. When she got to Libya, she was put in a connecting house, raped every day, sold in markets in open spaces, and she spent 3 months before she was able to get a passage across the Mediterranean. On that passage, she saw death, a 15-year-old girl. When I met her in Italy, I felt so ashamed. I felt so ashamed that we weren't doing our bit, that I wasn't doing my bit. I felt ashamed that we weren't speaking loud enough for her, because I know that when she did arrive in Italy or in Europe or wherever it may be, there was one path for her, which was back into exploitation in the markets that were created on our side of the world. So we need to do more. That's why organizations like the Commonwealth are so crucial in bringing that change. And I know the world is going through a difficult time, but it was in the 1940s, post-Second World War, that we created the National Health Service. When the UK was on its knees, it came to the fore and created something which is now one of the best health services around the world. So it's no excuse that times are tough. The Pope has called this as a contemporary, a wound on the body of contemporary society, and it's a crime against humanity. When I met that 15-year-old, what was happening to her was a crime against humanity. And it's by speaking to people like you, using your influence, using your networks, that perhaps we can stop this happening, not just in our own jurisdiction, but perhaps for that girl. She didn't have to leave Eritrea in the first place. So that is the issue we're fighting. It's something that is a serious crime. We need to make sure we understand what it is, but then that our responses are robust enough and effective enough to counter this global tragedy. Thank you very much.
Kevin, thank you so much. That was an extraordinary and a very moving presentation. I'm sure we all, I hope, share that view. I imagine, and I see there are 1 or 2 questions already in the chat, so I'll hand over to my good colleague, Peter Friedman, to conduct the Q&A, and please either put a note in chat or raise your hand if you would like to make a point or ask any question of Kevin. Peter, over to you. Thank you. Peter, you're muted.